Hi, everybody. Brad Truex here from Eastman's Woodlands and Wildlife Committee. And today we're going to talk about wetlands. So, what is a wetland? We thought we knew exactly what a wetland was. Were we wrong? Turns out wetlands are not always wet. There's the following is the official definition of a wetland. It's a vegetated area with soils that are saturated long enough during the growing season to develop anaerobic conditions and support hydrophytic vegetation. That's quite a mouthful, but it's certainly interesting. It does not require surface water. A wetland can certainly not have surface water as long as the ground is saturated enough. So standing water is not a requirement, and that's as long as the soil is saturated enough. So there are various types of wetland. There's actually multiple different types. While you may recognize swamps and marshes and wet meadows or beaver meadows as wetlands, even vernal pools may qualify as wetlands. Surface water, again, is water you can see on the surface, like a lake or a pond or a stream. Groundwater is water that's underneath the surface. And that's pretty much what most of us rely on for drinking water. We use the aquifers for that. So when you lose a wetland, you lose water supply, carbon balance, and biological diversity. So wetlands are extremely important to all of us. Water that seeps into the ground interacts with plant and soil microbes that break down pollutants and so on. And the wetlands act like giant sponges. They can store flood water and snow melt. And each acre of wetland can hold as much as 1.5 million gallons of water. That's a pretty incredible number. And once organic material breaks down slowly in the wetlands into peat or muck, that stores large amounts of carbon beneath the surface that otherwise would be released to the atmosphere. So it fights climate change and global warming. Wetlands are actually incredible carbon sinks, and hopefully they will slow carbon or climate change. They actually represent only 6 to 9% of Earth's surface, but they contain about 35% of all global terrestrial carbon. They actually store 3 to 5 times more carbon per acre than a tropical forest does. And we all know that we've often said that the Amazon rainforest is extremely important. Well, in fact, wetlands are probably more important than tropical forests. In terms of biological diversity, wetlands provide habitats for a variety of wildlife species. Animals like minks, muskrats, bats forage around the beaver ponds. Moose eat wetland plants at the edges of a beaver pond or a wetland, and they also eat many of the plants that are underwater. And that's because moose have a requirement for salt. And the plants that are underwater actually have a higher sodium content than terrestrial plants. So it's extremely important for the moose. Young salmon and trout need slowly moving water to develop as opposed to rapid moving streams. A whole host of animals, salamanders, frogs, turtles, water snakes, herons, grebes, ducks, rails, swallows, hawks, owls, flycatchers, kingfishers, all rely quite heavily on wetlands, particularly beaver-created habitats. And they also provide important habitat for great blue herons, osprey, and many other birds. And flooded trees turn into snags, which in turn create habitat for many insects, birds, and mammalian species. And many threatened and endangered plant and animal species also rely on the wetlands. So here's a list of the wetland types. You have swamps, marshes, bogs, fens, seeps, coastal wetlands, which include both salt marshes and mangroves, vernal pools, wetland meadows, or what we call beaver meadows, and artificial wetlands like rice paddies. So here's a typical swamp. Swamps are wetlands that are dominated by woody vegetation. So here you see many trees in this swamp, but there is some herbaceous plants that line the bottom of the swamp. And a whole host of wildlife species live in the swamps. So again, this is a picture of a hardwood swamp. You might also have a coniferous swamp and an herbaceous swamp. So swamps are wetlands that, again, dominated by woody vegetation, either trees or shrubs. And non-woody herbaceous vegetation also is on the floor of that swamp. And once again, there are hardwood swamps, coniferous swamps, shrub swamps, etc. And again, a whole host of wildlife, including frogs, salamanders, snakes, fish, ducks, and nesting songbirds live in the swamps. And once again, deer and bobcats, coyotes, foxes, and many other mammals will forage in the swamps. Marshes are wetlands that are dominated by herbaceous plants like cattails. Frogs, turtles, and muskrats live in the marshes. Many birds nest in the marshes or stop at the marshes during migration. And tidal and saltwater marshes down south are home to things like oysters, crabs, and shrimp. So again, marshes are wetlands that hold water for much of the growing season, but they're dominated by herbaceous vegetation as opposed to woody vegetation. And again, cattails, pickleweed, pond lilies, and many others are common in the marshes. And once again, in those marshes, you'll find frogs, turtles, muskrats, many birds, and a whole variety of wildlife species. Marshes are also favorite stopover sites for migrating birds. So here's a typical marsh. Again, they hold water for much of the growing season. They're dominated again by herbaceous plants as opposed to woody plants. And again, cattails, pickleweed, pond lilies, and other species are common. Eastman's wetland between Bog Brook and Eastman Brook actually best fits the definition of a marsh. A bog is a little bit different. Bogs have standing water permanently, and they have vegetation that decomposes into peat. Plants like cranberries grow in the bogs. And bogs, again, have permanent standing water or saturation of the soil, and the water is replenished mainly by precipitation rather than by groundwater. And they're characterized by very spongy, wet ground that's composed of decomposing vegetation, and that in turn turns into peat. They're usually acidic, but some are alkalinic, and sphagnum mosses are widespread in the bogs. Cranberries will grow in the bogs, and the term boggy essentially means wet and spongy, like a bog. So again, a fen is a little bit different. Fens are wetlands that are fed by calcium-rich groundwater, and that's due to the underlying limestone bedrock. Fens are dominated by sedges, grasses, rushes, and wildflowers, and they are peat accumulating wetlands as well. So again, they're fed by this calcium-rich groundwater seeping upward, and they occur where there's underlying limestone bedrock. They're a little bit more frequent in mid to high altitude latitude areas of the northern hemisphere, and they have a neutral or alkaline pH, and they're very mineral rich. Whereas bogs tend to be acidic, fens tend to be alkalinic. And their diverse plant community is dominated by sedges and grasses and rushes and wildflowers. And there are also some unusual plant species in fens like shrubby quinfoil or grass of Parnassus. And like bogs, they do accumulate peat. And fens differ from bogs in that they're less acidic and more nutrient rich, and they support a more diverse plant and wildlife community. Seeps are a place where groundwater emerges diffusely at the soil surface under gravitational pressure. So typically they occur at hillsides or slopes or at the foot of ledges. And they constitute the highest headwaters of many of our streams and rivers. So again, a seep is a place where groundwater emerges diffusely at the soil surface under gravitational features. And some flow only after a heavy rainfall or a snow melt. And some flow intermittently, whereas others flow all the time. And those that flow all the time and foster vegetation actually meet the definition of wetlands. Seeps usually occur, as I said, at hillsides or slopes or at the foot of ledges. And once again, they often constitute the highest headwaters of many of our streams and rivers. And the water usually emerges at a temperature that's about 45 degrees. So it tends to have a cooling effect during warm times and a warming effect during cool times. Very, very interesting climate control. Mangroves are coastal ecosystems with dense salt-tolerant trees and shrubs, and they're usually in tropical or subtropical tidal zones. And they actually protect shorelines from storms. They act as carbon-rich nurseries for a variety of marine life, and they thrive in low oxygen soils using very specialized roots. And some of the wildlife that occur there are crabs, snails, and many different species as well, birds. Salt marshes are tidal wetlands. They're regularly flooded by tides of seawater or brackish water, and they're very common in the southeastern U.S. And once again, you'll see crabs, oysters, and many bird species thriving in these saltwater marshes. This bottom picture down here shows an oyster bed that's in a saltwater marsh. As the tide comes in, this entire oyster bed will be covered by water. And then as the tide flows out, the oyster bed is uncovered. Vernal pools actually are also surprisingly wetlands. Vernal pools are small pools that are separate from wetlands and streams. They hold water during the spring and during the winter, and they're dry most of the rest of the year. And as a result, because there can be no fish in these ponds, many invertebrates that would be eaten by the fish are able to live in these vernal pools. So again, they certainly meet the definition of wetlands, and they hold water in the winter or spring, but they dry up for much of the remainder of the year. And again, as a result, there are no fish in these pools, but that means that the creatures that the fish would eat can actually live there. So amphibian eggs and larvae can thrive in these vernal pools. So frogs and salamanders live in the vernal pools, and tadpoles develop in the pools and then emerge and move out and become part of the larger ecosystem. Turtles may also move from pool to pool foraging, and many aquatic insects frequent these vernal pools. Barred owls also like to hang out near vernal pools. They'll eat the wood frogs that are commonly associated with the vernal pools, but they also hunt small animals that prey on amphibians like garter snakes, mink, and shrews. Okay, the classic beaver meadow. When beavers abandon a beaver pond, a new dynamic occurs. As the water drains, much of the sediment is left, and a sedge or grass-covered field is created, and that's what we call a beaver meadow. Wildflowers will pop up, many other diverse plants pop up amongst the grasses, and many snags remain. Here you can see in this picture, there's some standing dead trees back here, and those snags can be very desirable habitat for many, both bird species and mammalian species, as well as insects. So all these lead to a habitat that's very desirable for many wildlife species. Wet meadows have little or no standing water for most of the growing season. And classic example is the beaver meadow, but also abandoned hayfields or pastures might qualify for that definition. And again, wet meadows are dominated by herbaceous vegetation as opposed to a lot of woody vegetation. But the key thing is that they hold very much water underneath the surface, and they can act like huge sponges that can soak up flood water. They then can release some of that groundwater during periods of drought. So they're very huge sponges. They are good for flood control, but they also are helpful during periods of drought. Eastman's northern wetland is really a beaver meadow, which is again a form of a wet meadow. And these share many plant species with marshes, but they also have plants that are adapted for more dry areas, things like sedges, rushes, ferns, and forbs. Forbs are grasses that have flowers and wildflowers. And the many flowering plants are very good sources of nectar for pollinators. So just in terms of definitions, I've used a lot of terms you may be not familiar with. Grasses have round, hollow stems with joints or nodes, what we call knuckled stems. Sedges are grass-like plants that have triangular stems and parallel veins, and they're often found in wet areas. Rushes, on the other hand, have round, solid stems with no joints. And there's a rhyme. Sedges have edges, rushes are round, grasses have nodes all the way to ground. That's the way to remember these things. And forms are broadleaf, non-woody flowering plants with typically very showy flowers and netted veins in their leaves. Okay, so beaver pond succession. Just like our forests have succession, beaver ponds also have succession. They're very dynamic areas, and they produce a series of habitat types as they age. So again, when the beavers have exhausted all the food sources around the beaver pond, they abandon the pond, and the dam will gradually break down. Alternatively, something may have happened to the dam and result in the same drainage of the beaver pond to leave a beaver meadow. And once they're abandoned, they drain and they turn into what we call beaver meadows or wet meadows. So you can see a beaver meadow off the wetland spur off Springbrook Trail here at Eastman. Very beautiful out there. Although last year, the beavers actually built another dam that only lasted for a short time, and it actually created some havoc at the origin of that beaver meadow. So beaver meadows are ideal areas for wildlife like grouse to rear their broods. And deer and other animals will use these areas in summer because the edge is created between the woods and the meadow. So again, Lila Phillips wrote the book Beaverland. And at first glance, she says beaver meadows look like they're dry, but actually they work like wetlands, serving as huge underground sponges that soak up and hold large stores of water. And when flooding occurs, the beaver meadows absorb the flood water. And during periods of severe drought, the beaver meadows serve as caches of water to keep rivers from totally drying up. Uh, Rivers, streams, creeks, and brooks are samples of groundwater that's actually come to the surface. And water that lurks beneath the surface is equally important. In changing the course of rivers, beaver dams spread out the water over a wide area that it was like a slow-moving sheet of water. So again, the main wetland at Eastman is a jewel of biodiversity. It sits between Johns Glen and Heath Forest. It's best viewed from the Yellow Trail at Heath Forest, and it's formed by the confluence of Bog Brook and Eastman Brook. And it's part of the McDaniels Marsh watershed, under which the main aquifer sits. That's the key to the water quality for Grantham. Prior Eastman consultants have raved about the value of Eastman's wildland. And that wetland we're talking about really best fits the description of a marsh. And the beaver is the keystone to that wetland. The entire wetland ecology is dependent upon the beaver dam and the subsequent beaver pond and canal system. So here's a map that basically shows here is Eastman Brook, here's Bog Brook, and this whole area in between here is a big marshy area. Here you see the polishing ponds that are over in Johns Glen. So again, it's a huge wetland here, and it's really created by a series of beaver dams. There's a beaver dam that sits right here. There are probably several other beaver dams in this system. And it's really a marsh, and it's created by a series of beaver dams. So why are wetlands so important? Well, there are really three key contributions to the ecology: water storage, carbon storage, and habitat. And our shrinking wetlands are a threat to climate change and also a result of climate change. The wetlands act like sponges. They can, as we said before, can store floodwater and snow melt. And each acre of wetland can hold up to 1.5 million gallons of water. That's just an incredible number. And when there are heavy rains or snow melt, those wetlands soak up the water and they prevent flooding of property. And when there's a drought, the wetlands slowly release the groundwater to provide needed nourishment for many plants and animals. And the wetlands also reduce pollutants in the groundwater. They act like giant purifying systems. The water in the wetlands replenishes our aquifers. It creates sources for our drinking water and for irrigation of crops in many places. So they really act like giant water treatment facilities. They act like filters to cleanse the water of impurities and pollutants, and they recycle nutrients. Runoff chemicals from urban areas or farms often wash into the wetlands. And the wetland plants, including fungi and algae, absorb these harmful chemicals. And other pollutants sink to the bottom where they really just get buried in the soil and the sediment. So again, wetlands are, we mentioned, are incredible carbon sinks, and hopefully they're slowing climate change. And this statistics I gave before is just incredible. Wetlands only represent 6 to 9% of Earth's surface, but they contain about 35% of all the global terrestrial carbon, meaning carbon that's not up in the atmosphere or in the oceans. And they store 3 to 5 times more carbon than per acre than a tropical forest does. Really incredible statistic. So globally, wetlands store about 225 billion metric tons of carbon, and that's equivalent to carbon emission of 198 million cars per year. Incredible. So again, wetlands create the habitat for an incredible number of wildlife species. They produce food for fish, for invertebrates, for birds, and many other animal species. They support biodiversity, including 43% of our endangered species. And actually, 40% of all plant and animal species live or breed in wetlands as part of their life cycle. And 2/3 of all fish that are eaten worldwide depend on the wetlands at some time during their life cycle. That's a pretty striking number. And wetlands also are corridors for migrating birds and many other animals that are migrating. So take a look at many of the videos of wildlife taken by a game cam focusing on the beaver dam in Eastman's Heath Forest. You can go to that Eastman YouTube page, and there you're going to see bears, bobcats, red foxes, gray foxes, coyotes, minks, muskrats, beavers, ducks, deer, raccoons, fishers, and others. It's just incredible the amount of wildlife that surround that beaver pond, which basically is a marsh-like wetland. And that doesn't even account for the myriad of birds and fish and amphibians and reptile species that are in that wetland that we simply often don't see on the game cams. So beaver dams play a vital role in maintaining and diversifying the stream and riparian habitat. They construct dams that impound water and retain sediment. And the beaver is really, their activity substantially alters the physical, chemical, and biological characteristics of the entire river ecosystem. There are benefits to plants, fish, and wildlife. And the beaver dam provides habitat for vegetation, for aquatic invertebrates, for fish, for amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. And it's not just fishermen and wildlife who benefit. This is a very interesting fact. The weight of the water in a beaver pond presses the water deep into the ground, and that recharges the aquifers. And ultimately, those aquifers are used for drinking water, farm irrigation, and so on. And the sediment and pollutants that are filtered out in the slack waters actually clean the water. And beaver ponds, again, combat both floods and drought. Again, they act like a giant sponge. Again, during flood or snow melt, they will absorb the water. And during periods of drought, they will let out bits of water. And the floods will dissipate in the ponds. And once again, wildfires also hiss out in wet meadows. I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. So beaver dams slow fast-moving water, so that reduces erosion. And these were all been Goldfarb's book, Eager, which is a classic about beaver. So beaver pond benefits, direct benefits to humans. They decrease damaging floods. They recharge our drinking water aquifers. They remove pollutants from the surface and groundwater. They protect against drought and they decrease erosion. And they have many other benefits. They produce food for fish and other animals. They support biodiversity. They repair damaged stream channels and watersheds and a whole host. They provide great opportunities for wildlife observation, for hunting and trapping, canoeing and kayaking, fishing, photography, bird watching, and just relaxing in nature. So again, the beaver pond and the subsequent wetland have great benefits to everybody. So again, beaver ponds can store floodwater. Interestingly, the Milwaukee River watershed was estimated to support about 4,500 beavers. And a study showed that the beavers can complete floodwater storage 100 times more efficiently than an engineering department could. And the water storage developed by beaver ponds in that watershed estimated 1.7 billion gallons of water annually. And they estimated that the beavers actually saved $3.3 billion by the Milwaukee Sewage Department. So they put the beavers to work and were much more efficient than human engineers and mechanics. So beavers, they can dam a stream and it creates a beaver pond, but they also create one or more lodges. Pretty simple, right? No, it's much more complex. The beavers almost never make just one dam. Typically, they create a system of tiered dams, and they integrate into that system a system of canals. So it really creates a diverse ecosystem. And Eastman is no different. There are actually at least 12 beaver dams that have been identified in and around Eastman. And in addition, the beavers thin out the large trees that surround the pond, and that effectively extends a narrow stream corridor into a much broader wetland area. So again, beaver ponds have tremendous impact on the ecology. So again, in beaver meadows, when the water is running, oxygen enters it. Okay, under a beaver meadow, there are places where still water creates anaerobic conditions. Anaerobic means no oxygen. And there are anaerobic microbes that live there. And those microbes can break down nitrogen. So again, these anaerobic microbes really cleanse the water of nitrates, which is an important function. And they can actually remove about 80% of the nitrogen that enters them. And the dissolved carbon and nitrogen then continues to run downstream. And this is an interesting show from Elizabeth Fairfax, who's done a lot of work with the impact of beaver ponds on floods, drought, and fires. And over on the left, you see conditions where there are no beavers, on the right, where there are beavers. So again, typically, if say it's raining and so on, all the water will go straight down here. It does nothing for these plants that are on the surface. On the other hand, you have a stream with beavers, you can see that there's some groundwater right under these plants, so they tend to stay green longer. During drought conditions, what that means is that if you just have a simple stream, you only have a narrow area where you have good vegetation, and the rest of the vegetation dries out. Whereas here in a beaver, adjacent to a beaver pond, because there's now some groundwater, the area of wet vegetation is much bigger. And that has important implications when you're under fire conditions. So you can see here, if there's a forest fire, a wildfire, you have plants that are dry out here, and you only have a very narrow area where you have wet vegetation. Whereas around a beaver pond, you have a much broader area of wet plants that don't burn. So here's what happened. This was actually taken out in Idaho after a big wildfire that was out there. On the left, you see an area that did not have beavers. So all you have is very narrow area of green around a stream. On the other hand, in an area where there were beavers, they had a beaver pond and a beaver ecosystem. And look at the much vaster area of green that was preserved in that wildfire, simply because there was a beaver dam and a beaver pond there. And that's just showing a blow up of that. Okay, how about artificial wetlands? Well, rice paddies are artificial wetlands, and they support biodiversity and critical habitat for many water birds and aquatic species, particularly when they're flooded during non-growing seasons. And wetlands are dynamic. Once again, here you see when it rains or when it snows, you'll get some infiltrates into the groundwater. You get some runoff into the wetland. You get evaporation, so the water is going upward on a hot day. The trees and the other vegetation also transpire. They release water vapor upward. And again, from the wetland, we mentioned that the weight of the water here will push water down into the wet water table or the aquifer. So again, they're very dynamic structures. But there are threats to the wetlands. Again, more than 95% of our wetlands in the U.S. are freshwater, but more than half of the wetlands in the lower 48 states have disappeared since 1780. And that loss rates have actually increased by 50% since 2009. So we're seeing a tremendous acceleration of the loss of wetlands. Approximately 100 million wetland acres remain in the 48 contiguous states, but they continue to be lost at a rate of about 60,000 acres annually. So this is a serious threat. And the losses continue mostly in the southeast, in the Great Lakes region, and out in the prairies. Coastal watersheds have been particularly hard hit. Interestingly, New Hampshire has only lost about 9% of its wetlands since 1780, but Vermont has lost about 35%. And the causes of loss of wetlands are urbanization and human development, upland planted forests, agriculture, pollution, invasive species, and especially climate change and rise in the sea level. And interestingly, 75% of our wetlands are actually privately owned. They're not governmental property. So again, it's important that we all consider what can we do to preserve wetlands. So again, the biggest threat to wetlands is probably humans. We may disrupt the natural flows because we sometimes drainage from a wetland for agriculture or drainage into a wetland from new subdivisions. We also dig wells that may cause depressions that dry out the wetlands. And humans also pollute the wetlands through sewage or through industry, septic systems, etc. And humans sometimes will remove a beaver or remove a beaver dam, and that has a bad impact on the wetland ecology. And there are inadequate natural buffers. So, for instance, if you put a road next to a wetland, that has a negative impact on the wetland. And then, of course, there are invasive species like knotweed. And again, a biggie is climate change. So again, with climate change, we're seeing both periods of heavy precipitation interspersed with long periods of drought. We have temperature extremes, we have freeze-thaw cycles, and so on, all of which have a negative impact on the wetlands. And again, sea level rise is having a big impact on the tidal or saltwater marshes. So again, threats to wetlands also translate to threats to wildlife. There's loss of food sources for all sorts of wildlife, loss of breeding grounds for many different species, loss of stopovers for migrating birds and animals. And there are fewer homes for many species of mammals, birds, and amphibians. And once again, there are fewer fish spawning sites and nurseries for fish. So what can we do to protect our wetlands? Well, developmental planning is important, and regulatory oversight is really critical. And unfortunately, that's probably being eroded. We have parks and preserves. We have conservation easements that protect the wetlands. We need to protect their buffer areas. For instance, keeping livestock away from the wetlands because the livestock end up polluting the wetlands. And of course, education. We need to discourage or prevent dumping near wetlands. We need to be careful where we site our trails. We should keep our trails as best we can away from the wetland to prevent things from going into the water. And then, of course, restoration of wetlands. So the Federal Clean Water Act was passed in 1972, and that defined wetlands as navigable waters, wording soft regarding wetlands. So again, the wording really didn't apply so much to wetlands. In 2015, the EPA came out with the Clean Water Rule. And in 2020, the Navigable Waters Protection Rule actually included adjacent wetlands. But isolated ponds and wetlands were actually excluded from that because they're not connected to a navigable waterway. And they also removed protection from ephemeral streams, meaning streams that come and go. So it removes some protection from wetlands that don't have a surface water connection to an intermittent or perennial stream. And again, 51% of wetlands actually fall into that latter category. So that significantly reduced the impact of legislation that's protecting our wetlands. And now a newly proposed EPA definition would focus mostly on regulating permanent bodies of water. So things like streams, oceans, rivers, and lakes, and really curtails the broader definitions of wetlands that have been embraced by all prior administrations. So this change in legislation is a significant threat to the wetlands. So again, the most recent proposal would cover only those bodies of water that have surface water most of the time and are not connected to a lake, river, or stream. Okay, are these wetlands? Holes 11 and 14 at Eastman Golf Links. I have these big pockets of water where I usually end up hitting my golf ball. And each actually probably meets the definition of a wetland. So these are two wetlands I could probably do without. So I learned a lot about wetlands in creating this video. So I hope that you have too. Once again, we hope you'll come back.